Good morning, everyone. This is Isaac Steincamp with another video lecture for the Chess Summit Network. And for today, I decided to talk about a more psychological element in chess, which is playing against low-rated players. A lot of time, people just say, when you're playing someone, you just be active, active, active. Tactics will always win, especially against those low-rated players. And if you keep the position complicated, at some point they'll break. And this is true to some extent, but this also has a high margin of error for yourself as well. But I think what's important to understand about being active is that there's multiple different ways of being active. There's a tactical way, which we're all familiar with, attacking with pawns, looking for a lot of piece play. But there's also just a generally basic way of using all of your pieces, improving your position, but keeping your opponent at bay so that way there's no counterplay. Both ways work, and I wanted to show the way I prefer, which is to kind of just let my opponent sit and not really be able to do anything while I improve my position and go forth. And to do that, I wanted to show two games that I played. The first game I played was the State Chess Championship. My opponent's only about 1,200, but this is more of just a general example of this mentality. And then the next game, I'll show a game against a much higher rated opponent, about 1,800 from the National High School Chess Championships in Columbus this past year, where I was able to use the same idea of just letting my opponent sit, not really have any play, and then come in at the last minute and bring in all of my pieces. So here we go. I'm playing white in this game. This is the first round, and I play my favorite English line, and it's just generally basic development here. Knight c3, d6, d3, knight c6, knight f3, and my opponent kind of makes his first inaccuracy. He plays bishop to f5. This really isn't where this bishop belongs, but there's no real way to exploit the positioning of this bishop. Usually this bishop likes to be on e6 with the idea of playing d5, and that's generally how black tries to stay in the game in the opening. But I guess the best way to explain it is by playing bishop f5, he's not making a mistake in the sense that there's a way to exploit it. He's making a mistake in the sense that there's fewer options for him to play effectively going into the middle game, and that could create some dynamic opportunities for me to play. Seeing as there was no real way to exploit this bishop on f5, and this is a g60 time control, I just made the most principled moves I can. So castling, castling, and I need to develop my last piece, so I played the move bishop to g5, pinning the knight, and I'm going to create some problems for my opponent. My opponent plays h6. Well, I have to take. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, knight d5. So even though I've given away the pair of bishops, the position isn't really open enough for my opponent to really be able to have any sort of advantage. In the meanwhile, because my opponent played his bishop to f5, this d5 square is a big hole for me to use as an outpost for my knight. So by putting it on d5, I'm not only attacking the c7 square, I'm attacking f6, and my opponent has to retreat his queen to d8. So even though I don't have a tangible advantage, if you think about it, I played bishop to g5, bishop takes f6, and my opponent played queen takes f6, and to provoke bishop takes f6, he had to play h6. So he made a pawn weakness here, and then he played 2 moves with his queen, and in exchange, I got an outpost. So for me, even though there's no immediate winning line, I know I'm better in this position. I just have to make sure that my opponent's bishops don't become too active. My opponent played I played e3 here, and then my opponent played the move knight to b4. Definitely an interesting way of challenging my knight, but if I play a move like knight to c3, obviously my d3 pawn is hanging. So here I took, but my opponent doesn't really have anything to show for his opening. He has the bishop pair, but again, it's not quite clear what it's doing, and in fact, my bishop on g2 could become a real player in the game, as this light square diagonal from a8 to h1 is really occupied by my bishop. So whenever you're playing, in a position where you have a distinct advantage, you want to think about principled ways of making that advantage bigger. And to start out this game, I decided to go with space. So I played the move a3. My opponent played bishop to c5, and now I have a choice. I can play both b4 and I can play d4. And in this game, I wanted to go for more of a bind position, so I played the move d4. I think b4 is fine, but after bishop to b6, it's not quite clear how I'm playing this move c5. And in some lines, if I play d4, maybe my opponent can play c5. That kind of seemed unnecessary to allow this counterplay. It seemed like this bishop on c5 was kind of doomed to either have to trade away from my knight or have to go back to b6 anyways. So I figured, let's just play d4, control the center. I don't really have any protectors of the e4 square, but that doesn't matter since my bishop on g2 is about to become very active. So my opponent took probably the right move, And again, I have another choice. I can play both e takes d4 and knight takes d4. I think, honestly, both of these moves are perfectly fine. It's really about style and how you want the game to proceed. As both plans take very different turns. But the thing I didn't like about e takes d4 is it opens up the position a little bit, and as we know, the bishop pair really likes open positions more than closed positions. So I was thinking maybe like, okay, e takes d4, bishop b6. c5 is probably not what my opponent's looking for, as I would further block in my opponent's bishop from b6. But this f5 bishop's kind of unquestioned. If I ever attack it, it just goes back to h7. My opponent probably isn't better, but at the same time, my opponent isn't worse, and that's not exactly what I want in a short time control game. So to make the game more interesting, I played this move knight takes d4 with the idea that I'm opening up my light squared bishop, which I think is a lot stronger than my opponent's f5 bishop. I'm attacking the f5 bishop. I still have a lot of control over the center. If my opponent kind of sits and does nothing, this move b4 is coming, and my goal is to have as many active pieces as possible. So if my opponent plays bishop takes d4, I get to then in turn develop another piece with queen takes d4. I have a developmental advantage. The b7 pawn is really weak, and I can play on the half-open d file and try to find some sort of positional long-term advantage to secure this game. My opponent took on d4. I was really happy to see this move, but in all honesty, there really isn't too much for my opponent to do. For example, he could play bishop to h7, but then I can play b4, and then after bishop b6, bishop takes b7 is perfectly reasonable. The c6 square gets really weak, so I really think maybe bishop takes d4. There's really nothing else he can do, but I'm now positionally better. I have a developmental advantage. I control the center. I have a nice semi-bind position because my e3 pawn's on e3, not on e4. But that allows my g2 bishop to be really active, attacking the b7 square, and really trying to create some light square weaknesses. And here is where I think my opponent really starts to fold, and this is how I'm going to transition to this idea of talking about playing against low-rated players by being active but not necessarily being tactical. My opponent plays this move c6. And here, it's really important to identify, your opponent's weaknesses. Whenever you're playing someone weaker and they make a questionable move, you always have to ask, what is it that you don't like about your opponent's move? And in this case, the obvious answer is the d6 pawn. And in most games, if you're playing someone 1500 plus, the answer won't be this easy. But I think maybe my opponent could have waited a move. After bishop takes b7, he can play rook on a to b8, but the b2 pawn is protected by the queen on d4. So it's not exactly pleasant. d5 is never an option. And, black would love to trade off the light squared bishops, but because he hasn't developed, that's not an option on the table. And bishop to c8 is definitely not a move you want to make. So c6, in a g60 type control, I could see how this is your go-to move. You're going into an endgame. It's same-colored bishops, but at the same time, there's still heavy pieces on the board. So, there's some draw potential there, perhaps. And, it's not like I have two central pawns. I only have one central pawn. So it's not like a full pawn advantage just yet. I have to prove that I'm better here. So the first question is, which rook do I bring to d1? The f1 rook or the a1 rook? Well, whenever you know that you're in a better position, you want to make sure that all of your pieces are active and on the best possible square they can be. This goes back to my first video I made on the Chess Summit Network, which is about optimization. And if I play this move rook on a to d1, yes, the d1 rook is really strong. I'm going to be able to win the d6 pawn, but it's not quite clear what my f1 rook is going to do. And, I want to make sure I can expand my queen side by using both rooks, and I should be totally fine. So I play the move rook on f to d1. There's no way to protect the d6 pawn, so my opponent goes for queen to b6. I quickly create doubled pawns for him and play rook takes d6. So here we are in an endgame. I'm playing a low-rated opponent. I'm up by a pawn. I clearly have the better pieces. But it's really easy to mess up these positions. If you try to be too active and just push and push and push your advantage, it's really easy to make a mistake and fall back and have to start all over again. And, I hear that more often from higher-rated players playing against low-rated players than I do of the story of, oh, I went all out and look what happened. So, my opponent played bishop to e6, and I think that this is the first critical positional move I have to make. If I play the move b3, it seems really simple, but in actuality, now the a3 pawn would be weak by playing this move b3. So my rook on a1 would have to sit there until I play a move like a4, which could create another weakness. At the same time, if I play b3, my opponent also has the option b5. You know, it'll create doubled pawns for him, like isolated double pawns for him. So b3, b5, c takes b5, c takes b5. You know, I'm definitely better, but my opponent's opening up the position to allow him to become more active, and that's not really what I want to do. I want my opponent who perhaps his understanding of chess is not as developed as mine, in the shorter time control, to have to really sit and use that time, and create a time disadvantage as well. So, I looked at the move rook to c1, but by playing rook to c1, I allow this move rook to a4 to be really strong. Obviously, I can't play b4 because the rook takes a3. So I needed a waiting move to allow my rook to move away from a1 without creating, potential weaknesses. And the best move I came up with was this move bishop to f1. And the reasoning is black's best move, or most active move, rook to a4, is easily met by b3. And now after rook to a5, I play a4. And now his rook is shut out of the game. The e6 bishop is kind of useless because all of my queenside pawns are light squared. And, for him to play for an advantage, he needs to play on the queen side. And his bishop, it doesn't really have any scope now on the a2 to g8 diagonal. Meanwhile, I have the d file, and I'm still in control of the game. My opponent's rooks are disconnected. It's not quite clear what his rook's going to do from a5, and there's no future plan for black. So my goal here is, now that I have the advantage, I need to keep my opponent at bay and slowly improve my position, and the mistakes will come to me. So he plays the move bishop to g4. A somewhat annoying move is I can't play this move rook on a to d1. So I decided here, okay, let's just kick the bishop, h3, and my opponent played a tricky move here, bishop to f5, with the idea that if I play rook on a to d1, I allow bishop to c2 to happen, and then, we're back to either an equal, or maybe I'm even losing that endgame. So I can't really do that. If I play a move like bishop d3, h3 is hanging. So the question is, how do I continue to mobilize my advantage? And the honest truth here is, you try to think, okay, I need to be active as soon as possible. I'm winning. Let's keep that up. But my opponent can't do anything in this position, so it's okay to take an extra tempo to fully develop my advantage. So here I played the move rook to a2. It stops bishop c2, but it also prepares rook on a to d2. My opponent's rooks are so not coordinated that he can't play like a move like rook d8 and force a rook trade. He's just worst here. So he plays rook on a to a8, admitting his mistake of trying to play too much on the queen side. I played rook on a to d2. And my opponent played rook on f to e8 with the idea of trying to hold my f pawn to protect the e pawn, but this really isn't too much for me. And now here's where I can start playing for space. I played g4. My opponent plays bishop to e6. And in order to really start cracking down on my opponent and create a true bind in this position, I had to ask myself, what is my opponent's best resource in this position to reopen the position and to try to create weaknesses? So I'm going to let you think for a minute. What do you think is black's best resource? So if you need a minute, pause the video. You may have already found it. It's not that difficult if you consider all of black's other options, but the move is f5. And, if black plays this move f5 and g takes f happens and bishop takes f, black's still worse, but he's creating more options for himself, and I didn't really want that to happen. So I played this move e4. The idea behind e4 is, obviously, if he plays f5, he's outnumbered. E takes f5 is an option. G takes f5 is also perfectly fine. I would have probably gone for e takes f, but my opponent wouldn't do that at this point. And if he plays the move g6, I can play f4. So if he plays f5, I can play g takes f, and then follow that up with the move e5, and now I have passed pawn. So I'm just keeping my opponent at bay. This move e4 isn't anything special. I'm not really knocking the door yet. I'm just asking my opponent, what is he going to do? And chances are my opponent's going to make a mistake trying to be too active. So my opponent played king to f8. I played f4. He played f6, trying to get his pawns on the opposite colored square of his bishop. And, here again, I'm winning, but it's not quite clear how I'm winning yet. So rather than trying to force something to happen, which may or may not work, in a g60 time control, you don't have too much time to waste. So again, I'm just improving my position. King to f2, getting my king in the endgame. You can't win an endgame without your king. My opponent plays bishop to f7. I played king to f3. Now he plays bishop to g6. And, my opponent, who's a much lower rated opponent, he's done well up to this point, but it's very clear he doesn't quite know where his pieces need to be either. And, at any point I can play this move rook to d7. I can try to block out my opponent's bishop. I thought about f5, but the problem with f5 is that now all of my pawns are in light squares, and my f1 bishop has nowhere to go. So to some extent, I do need to open up the position, but at the same time, I need to also be, considerate of my opponent's, counterplays. So, you have to be very delicate with these positions. And, generally when your opponent makes enough mistakes, there are tactical resources, and I found one here. It's just the move e5. Obviously, if f takes e5, the bishop on g6 is unprotected, and if f takes e5, rook takes g6, if he plays e takes f4, I'm perfectly happy being up a piece. If he plays e4 check, there's no way that pass pawns anything after king to e3. So, my opponent can't really do anything. He played the move bishop to f7, and here I have a choice. I can try to keep that pawn on e5, but then I'm using a lot of offensive resources to be defensive, or I can try to create weaknesses. By playing e takes f6, I create two isolated pawns rather, f6 and h6, and it's not quite clear what my opponent's e8 rook is going to do to use this e-file. There's really nothing there for my opponent. So here I just grabbed a pawn, rook takes f6, king g7, rook on f to d6. There's nothing else for me to do, but I'm up 2 pawns now. My opponent plays rook to e7, and here I just played f5. I'm further limiting the scope of my opponent's bishop. I'm threatening this move f6. I'm really putting the question on my opponent. All of my forcing moves so far have been easily stopped, but all of them also improve my position long term. Meanwhile, my opponent trying to create play has created, short-term options but long-term weaknesses. And this is the kind of play that I want to be active and win this game without making any mistakes. My opponent plays king to h7, and here I'm looking for different resources, and I decided that it's time to bring my bishop into the game. My opponent is very limited in terms of how he can play, and I'm going to use my light squares to help me win. So I played the move bishop to d3, threatening this move f6 check. This is a critical move, obviously, as it's a discovered attack and a discovered check. My opponent played king to g8, and here I just played bishop to e4, blocking off the e-file. There's nothing else to do. I thought maybe my opponent would try rook on a to e8, at which point I could maybe play like rook d4. I could maybe even go for rook d8 later in some lines. But the point of bishop e4 is simply to just shut down the diagonal and put pressure on some of the queenside pawns at some point. My opponent plays rook to c8, and here I just played f6. And I'm going to start creating a mating net. This f6 pawn does a really nice job of controlling the dark squares around the king. And my bishop actually does a really nice job controlling the light squares. So if he's not careful, checkmate's around the corner. My opponent played rook on e to c7, and now his position falls apart. Rook to d8, bishop to e8, and rather than going for anything too fancy here, just bishop g6, king f8, bishop takes e8, rook f7. If he takes my rook on d8, I'm playing rook takes d8, and then I have a whole bunch of discovered threats. After rook to f7, a lot of players would probably just go up the extra rook, but there's actually a pretty simple checkmate here. Just bishop takes c6 check, rook takes d8, and rook takes d8 checkmate. So, looking back on this game, I didn't really do anything too special. If you were going over this game, it'd be really easy to go over it really quickly and just say, oh, white was the better player and white won. But I think the mentality and the psychological approach to bring to this game was what was important. This was a state championships. There were 4 rounds on the first day. This was the round 1 of 4. It would be very easy to try to use all of my energy in this game trying to find every single tactical resource to make this game quick, short, and pretty so I could show my friends. But when you're in a tournament and there's a lot on the line, you want to use as few resources as possible. And if you are truly the better player, you can find these small ways to improve your position without making things so complicated that you're really struggling to find the right move. Even though that this game was against someone who's significantly lower rated than me, I feel like this approach is something that a lot of people take for granted, and I want to show that in my next game. Let me bring up the PDF that I played at the National High School Chess Championship back in April to further prove my point. So I'm playing white again. This is round 3. I'm 1 out of 2 at this point. I won the first round in a really nice game, and the second game I should have drawn, but I got into some serious time trouble and messed up the endgame against a 2200 rated player, so I was 1 for 2, and I was playing a 1700 rated this round, and there were 3 games, so it was really important that I get a result and start off the morning right to kind of bounce back from what should have been a draw to see how I could do. So again, I play the English, one of my favorite openings, e6, g3, d5. And I decided to go for a ready structure because I know that that's probably the opening my opponent has studied the least. So my opponent played knight to c6, which I thought was odd. Usually you see the move c5, which is the more aggressive approach, or c6, and then, if c5 then knight c6, or c6 then knight d7. And that seemed to be more natural. But now after knight c6, there's no immediate way to punish this move, but the knight is kind of in the way of the c-pawn. The c-pawn's a major player in this opening. And, I believe Michal Marin covers this line in his English repertoire book, but, I didn't really look at this line too much, because I'd never seen it before. But, when I did, in my studies, my mentality was, okay, black has to waste a move. This is very passive. It's hard for black to play for a while. So I was very happy to see this move from my opponent as, I'm the high-rated player, and I'm the one trying to win this game. So I castle, bishop e7, b3, just keeping things pretty simple. Castles, bishop b2, b6. And, I thought here about playing e3 and then d4 and then just playing for space and keeping things simple. But my opponent hasn't really committed her bishop yet. If I played the move e3, bishop to a6 can be kind of annoying, but not really. I wanted to wait and see what my opponent would do. So here I played the move d3, so bishop a6 is no longer an option. My opponent played bishop to b7, and I'm kind of looking for improving moves here. I'm not really too worried about anything my opponent can do. And I decided the easiest thing to do would be to slowly build up my position. I want to get my queen off the d file, put my rook on d1, develop my knight. And so here I kind of just slow played the position. Pawn to e3. My opponent played rook to c8, and at this point, I kind of knew my opponent wasn't comfortable with the position because rook to c8 is a move that you would make to push the c pawn. So what do I know is coming? Well, the knight has to go back to b8 to push the c pawn. So this is a free tempo that I'm going to use. I use that tempo to slow play the position and make sure I'm solid and I have no weaknesses. So I decided to just continue with my plan here. Queen e2, knight b8, rook d1. So now if d takes c4 ever happens, I'm playing d takes c4 myself. I'm going to take advantage of the d file. And it's harder for my opponent to get into an equal position. My opponent played c5, and here I decided to just continue developing my position. I have a choice here. I can play knight a3, knight c3, knight d2. I'm probably not looking so much at knight a3, but here, I have an interesting option. Do I play knight c3 or knight d2? Well, if I play knight d2, I ruled this out this move pretty quickly because obviously if d takes c4, I can't play d takes c4 with the same strength I could as if my knight was on c3. And from c3, I can potentially go to b5. And, my opponent's bishop on e7 is kind of passive right now. I'd like to be on d6. Maybe my opponent wants to play queen c7 and the rook on f to d8. So playing a move like knight c3 would help me, play knight b5 and slow down my opponent. So I played the move knight c3. My opponent played a6. And I'm looking for different ways to break the position. And I decided to use kind of a more classical idea of trying to create hanging pawns. I'm going to take once at d5. I'm going to have the two central pawns. And at the right moment, I'm playing the move d4 and try to play against my opponent's c and d pawns. So I played c takes d5. My opponent plays knight takes d5. I gladly trade off my knight as it opens up the dark squared diagonal. E takes d5. And, here I have a lot of choices. I chose a more passive move because it improved my position. d4 is a very respectable move, and probably a move I should have played. But I figured, well, after d4, my opponent can play c4. My opponent does have resources for counterplay. The move I played, which was rook on a to c1, I'm threatening d4 now because c4 is not an option. If my opponent plays b5, I can kind of play the position like a hedgehog. If my pawn on a2 was on a3, this is a very respectable position that black usually uses. But now I'm playing it with white a tempo ahead. And my opponent's development isn't quite resolved yet. The knight's still on b8. The bishop isn't doing too much on b7. It's not really contesting my light squared g2 bishop. And my bishop on b2, at the right moment could be a real monster. So my opponent played this move b5, and, here again I have a choice to make. Do I play d4 or do I play e4? And I think both of them are respectable moves. But again, if I play this move d4, I do cut off my b2 bishop. My opponent plays c4, and after b takes c, d takes c, I knew I had the central pawn advantage. I knew that was better for me in the endgame, but I thought, the 3-on-1 on the queen side, okay, I'm probably better, but why am I giving my opponent so much counterplay when she hasn't really bothered to develop her own position? So I decided to go for e4, and I really like the position that I got. After move e4, I thought, okay, black's best move is to play d4, cutting off my bishop, but now I can play a move like knight to d2 or knight to e1 and follow that up with f4. So I was thinking maybe like d4, knight d2, then rook f1, then f4, h3, g4, and I figured I could just easily create counterplay on the king side. My opponent's position isn't quite solved yet because her pieces aren't quite developed. She just played knight d7, knight b6, and then she can start talking about playing c4. So also at the same time, if she ever does play c4 with a pawn on d4, the pawn on d4 could be a weakness. So I liked the positions that I was getting into there, and I figured that they were more, classical, almost King's Indian-like positions. But my opponent didn't go for this. She played d takes e4. I played d takes e4. And she played queen b6. So, I wasn't sure exactly if I was better, or if I was, how much better I was. But I kind of broke down the position positionally to try to create an advantage. So I compared my development, right? My opponent's not exactly developed. Her knight on b8's not doing what she wants to do. I have a really amazing bishop on b2. My rooks on c1 and d1 are perfectly placed. So my best guess was my opponent's just 2 tempos down. And, what does that mean? Well, I've been to a couple of programs, with grandmasters, and the standard measure I've heard is that if you're 3 tempos down, that's the equivalent of being 1 pawn down. So when I was at the board, my best guess in this position was, okay, I'm maybe up +6, maybe generously. But I knew that I needed a way to kind of push this, slight advantage. And, the first thing I could easily, grasp was, okay, my opponent's knight on b8 is probably the number one thing that's stopping her from being back in this game. So it can go to c6 right now, and I kind of wanted to limit that. So I played this move knight to e5 fairly quickly. Obviously, a move like f6 would weaken her position and block her e7 bishop. And, if she played knight c6, I could consider, taking, but, obviously knight d7 is a pretty simple fork. So she has to stop this idea of knight d7 to then play knight c6. I figured at some point she could probably pull it off, but in that amount of time, I could improve my position with slow play, and I would have the better game. My opponent played rook on c to d8. I was okay with this move. I thought rook on f to d8 would be more natural. But here I just played king to h1. Again, I really don't want to do too much with my position just yet, but my thought is to play f4. And I kind of found this move c4 check to be a little bit annoying with my king on g1. So my opponent being 2 tempi down, I feel rather confident in my position. I was like, okay, let's just play this move king to h1. It's probably not the best move, but it does help me improve my position. Rook takes d1, rook takes d1, rook to d8. So my opponent really wants to trade the rooks off the board. And, if I play a move like rook to c1 or rook to e1, my opponent can just play the move knight d7, and she's perfectly fine. So, I thought, okay, do I want to play rook takes d8? But my opponent can just play this move, queen takes d8, and then she has control of the d file. And I feel like even if my opponent's behind in development, if she has the d file, that's enough to be at least equal. So I didn't want to take on d8, and I kind of realized if I tried to do too much with my queen, like play a move like queen g4 or queen h5, rook takes d1 check forces my queen to come back to d1. So I saw this as an opportunity to make a general improving move. So I played this move h4. What's my idea? Well, I figured rook takes d1 would come, and I would play queen takes d1, and then I could follow it up by starting to push my h-pawn, create some advantages, or maybe use the g5 square as an outpost for my knight, because at some point my knight on e5 does need to move out of the way for my bishop on b2 to attack. So my opponent took on d1, I took on d1, and my opponent played queen d8, offering the queen trade. So I guess the first question is, would you play queen takes d8 here? Obviously, if you play queen takes d8, bishop takes d8, and all of black's pieces are kind of in the corner, a little bit inactive. So why don't you pause the video and calculate here, would you consider taking the queen on d8? Okay, well, if you need more time, pause the video. But if you play queen takes d8, bishop takes d8, you don't actually have like a material advantage to justify going into this complex minor piece endgame with three minor pieces on the board, both sides having the pair of bishops. There's no justifiable advantage. After queen takes d8, bishop takes d8, that b8 knight's coming out to c6. And I figured that this endgame would be fairly drawish, and I knew that this is what my opponent wanted. But again, my opponent's a tempo down, not quite in time. It's time to use my queen as a major attacker in the game. So I played this move queen to h5, attacking a pretty critical weakness here, the f7 pawn. And my thought was, if my opponent plays this move g6, I can play the move queen f3, attacking f7, and then if she plays queen to f8, I can follow that up with h5, further building up pressure. I haven't done anything too special, but by making these small improving moves, I'm able to get some fairly nice positions. My opponent played the move queen to e8, protecting the f7 pawn, but now here was the meat of my plan. I knew that I had to move the knight away from e5 for my dark squared bishop to attack g7, but how do I go about doing that? Well, I figured the easiest way to do that was knight g4. My opponent played knight d7, and now I had to see this move before I played the move knight g4 to really be able to have any sort of advantage. If I don't find this move, I think I'm probably equal, but this move comes just in time. Why don't you pause the video and try to see if you can't figure this one out too. Okay, well, if you found the incredibly fun knight to h6 check, you are on point. Obviously, after g takes h6, my opponent's in a lot of trouble over here on the king side. I can play queen takes h6 and threaten queen g7 checkmate. And if my opponent tries to block with a minor piece on f6, like knight takes f6, I can play bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6. And I knew that, with the queens on the board, this would be, not an easy endgame still, but I'm definitely winning. My opponent has a really weak king side with light squared weaknesses, which is perfect for my bishop. I have a central pawn that I can try to push for an advantage. And, I was fairly happy with this position. The other option, obviously, is g takes h6, queen to g4 check, and then queen g7 checkmate. So she can't take the knight. She plays the move king to f8. And now I had to also see this move when I played the move knight to g4, because if obviously she took, I'm winning, but so she won't take. What's my best move? It's just knight f5. Here I'm threatening to take on h7 and really infiltrate my opponent's king side. Knight takes e7 is not really what I'm looking at. I'm looking at just attacking both of these pawns and something will fall. My opponent plays the move f6, and after queen takes h7, queen f7, queen h8, my opponent resigned as queen g8, loses pretty quickly after queen takes, king takes, knight takes e7. And, this endgame I can win with my eyes closed, and you can too. So, what's the takeaway from this game? I didn't really do anything special. It was just me improving the position one step at a time. Recognizing that my opponent was at least one tempo behind in development, maybe even two, let me use that time to improve my position. Find moves like h4, king to h1, just these very natural moves. And at the critical moment, a tactical opportunity came, which was that move knight to h6 followed by knight to f5. So when people tell you to just be active, it doesn't always mean to just be tactical. It just means to look for the best possible moves. In this game, I wasn't, in both of these games rather, I wasn't passive. I was just, I found concrete ways to get a positional advantage, and I found ways to make them bigger. In this game, it was a little bit slower because I went for that hedgehog plan first and then decided to go for the king side. But it worked either way, and my opponent, still behind in development, just was not in time to make it. And, that's no accident. It's not that my opponent's playing bad chess. It's just that, once you make a mistake and you kind of sit on that mistake and stop your opponent from really being able to do anything, it's really hard to try to come back from that kind of position. Yes, your games take longer, but on the bright side, it's less draining on your energy. It means that you can, spend less time on your moves because your moves are based on intuition. And, this is kind of how players like Karpov play and Petrosian play, in some cases Kramnik too. So it's very important to stop your opponent from doing what they can first. Let them try to be active because that's more likely to produce a mistake, and then go for the jugular. All right, this was Isaac Steincamp. This is a fun video. I hope you enjoyed it. And this is me signing off. Thank you.